laptops. I have to be seeing there's one there that I found that's open. It's not that. Oh, you got it. Okay, you're all set.
I brought mine.
You did much better than I
I've been coughing up a storm recently, so I came prepared.
Good evening, and welcome to this evening's program on two important questions that will appear on the May ballot. I'm Margaret Bush, President of... Let's start over. I'm Margaret Bush, President of the Brookline League of Women Voters, which is sponsoring this program. The League is a nonpartisan membership program organization of men and women who are strongly committed to the voting process and to voter education. We know that some of you in the audience and some of you who are watching this on television are members of the League. If you're not a member, please consider joining. The League does not endorse candidates, and we are not endorsing a particular vote on the override questions on the ballot. We have been following the issues since 2013, when the Selectmen in Brookline appointed a special committee to consider the space needs in the Brookline schools that are being caused by the burgeoning population of children in Brookline. Later in 2013, the Selectmen appointed a committee to propose the matters of override to support the needs of government and of schools in Brookline. And the Selectmen will now put those questions that were chosen on the May ballot. Tonight's panel members represent both sides of the issue, and representing the school committee is Rebecca Stone, and Neil Wishinsky, who's a member of the Board of Selectmen, will speak in favor of the ballot questions. And on the other side, representing no on the override question, are Richard Benka and Carol Levin. Our timekeeper tonight is Lee Cook-Childs, and our moderator is Amelia Koch, who is active now in the Brookline League and has been active in the Newton League of Women Voters, and has moderated some candidate forums, and she usually moderates the warrant article forums as well. And we'll turn it over now to Amelia.
Welcome. We're glad to see you all here. Thank you for coming. As was mentioned, we're here to discuss the override proposal, and the four candidates who will be speaking are Richard Benka and Carol Levin, and Neil Wishinsky and Rebecca Stone. So thank you also for being prepared and for coming tonight. The format of tonight's debate will be opening statements by both parties. That's the party to go first has been decided in advance. And we'll reverse that order for closing statements at the end. And then we hope that the majority of the evening, about a little over an hour, will be taken up with questions from the audience. And again, both sides will have a chance to answer any question that comes forward, with alternating sides going first with each question. And I think we can go ahead and begin with the panelists' opening presentations. And I believe we are starting with the group that's in favor. And if you would pick whichever one of you is going first and begin, you have 4 minutes.
Okay. First, Rebecca and I would like to thank the League of Women Voters for hosting this event. I'm Neil Wishinsky. I'm on the Board of Selectmen. We're here tonight to discuss two questions on the ballot for May 5th. Question 1 is a Proposition 2.5 operating override for school enrollment needs and to protect town services. Question 2 is a debt exclusion that will allow the town to finance over time a long-awaited and absolutely crucial renovation and expansion of the devotion school. The Vote Yes for Brookline campaign, endorsed by all 5 selectmen, all 9 school committee members, endorsed by Brookline PACs, endorsed by over half the elected town meeting members, and endorsed by literally hundreds of neighbors and friends, a real grassroots movement, strongly urges a yes vote on both questions. Like so many of you, I came to Brookline decades ago because it's a fantastic place to raise a family. Unlike much of Brookline today, I'm a member of Brookline's shrinking middle class. We sank everything we had into our 2-decker in the Point where we still live. I, like all of you, am concerned about the cost of housing, of which real estate taxes are a piece. The decision to place an override on the ballot is a balance of affordability against the demand for services. It's not a decision I take lightly. Everyone who studied the issue agrees that we need an operating override because more than 38% enrollment growth in our elementary schools has created a severe structural deficit for the schools. That deficit will get worse over the next few years as enrollment growth expands into the high school. And that begins next year with our first freshman class of over 500 students. In comparison, our kindergarten class has over 700 students. The 2 campaigns represented here tonight also agree that the Devotion School project must get financed through the Question 2 debt exclusion. Where we disagree is on the solution to the structural operating deficit, the subject of Question 1. We believe that the carefully constructed finance plan, which includes a $7.665 million override plus fee increases and efficiencies phased in over 3 years, provides the right mix of prudent resources to the schools with concern and respect to the taxpayer. The No campaign is advocating a smaller override, one that isn't on the ballot, that would save the median condo owner something like $10 next year and under $40 a year in 2017 and beyond. A small difference to the taxpayer will make a huge difference to the schools and the kids. The disruption of a no vote is hardly worth the cost difference. Now let me return to Question 2, the Devotion debt exclusion. Devotion has grown from 600 students a few years ago to 800 today. The building is decrepit, to say the least. Growth has been handled by converting locker rooms and closets into learning spaces, and by calling a table in the hallway or divider on a stairwell landing a workspace. In September, the middle grades are moving to the old Lincoln School. With a renovated and expanded Devotion, over 1,000 kids will learn in classrooms rather than closets and stairways. It will allow Devotion's middle grades to come back from the old Lincoln, and it will provide some relief to nearby schools, including Pierce and Driscoll, as we continue to pursue viable options for the remainder of the space problem in our schools. If Question 2 fails, there'll be a domino effect. Devotion will be indefinitely split between its current decrepit building and the old Lincoln School. Additionally, we'll lose more than $20 million in state construction aid. Old Lincoln will also not be available for the high school.
Thank you very much, Neil. And if the panelists could please keep a weather eye for these cards, marking the time.
Thank you, and thank you to the League and all of you for being here tonight. Question 1, the operating override, is about the value we place on educational excellence in Brookline. We all know that regardless of whether they came here for the schools, Brookline residents care about quality public education. They know that great public school systems drive property values. They know that a town that cares so deeply about public education also cares deeply about other qualities of life issues like libraries, park spaces, senior services, the environment, and supports for those living with challenges such as disability or poverty. What does it mean to value public education? It means that high expectations and support for every student's success is not just rhetoric. It's a home visitor bearing books for children still too young for school, a specialist working with kids to unpack a problem in a classroom, a program to ease a student's transitions back to school after a long absence, or the Steps to Success program that reaches out to children living in public housing beginning in 4th grade. It means not just saying we value our teachers, but showing it by letting their children come to school here so that teachers aren't forced to choose between the student who seeks them out after class and the child waiting for them to come home. It means that our commitments to small class sizes and great teaching, which benefit all students, professional development for teachers, neighborhood schools, the K-8 system, racial diversity in our classrooms from the METCO program, extension services for struggling students and for those who need more challenge, foreign language in kindergarten, and having art, physical education, and music as regular parts of the school day are not just frills that we toss aside when condos are filled with more and more families. Educational excellence is our trademark because what we value drives what we do. Why do we need $7.67 million more to do that? Well, as Neil will attest, $7.67 million was a compromise, as political decisions usually are. The Selectmen considered two competing recommendations from the Override Study Committee. They looked at the voluminous data that accompanied that analysis. They listened to the views of the public. They consulted the town administrator and the schools about the tax burden, about residents' ability to pay, about costs over time and future liabilities. They did not split the baby in half like Solomon. What they did was actually exercise judgment and leadership, which is what we expect the town's executive body to do. With this override, the schools will have to cut more than $2 million from budgets over the next 3 years to make it all work, but we'll do that by phasing some things in more slowly, waiting longer to make some reforms that we've been waiting to make. But with this override, we will be able to meet this town's expectation of excellence in the public schools. We will finally respond to the program review of Enrichment Challenge support and make it stronger for all students. We will save our flagship elementary world language program and adjust it to meet the needs of children whose already improved foreign language proficiency needs to be reflected in our upper grade teaching. We will finally bring our educational technology up to modern school standards and give all schools technology capacity that only some students are able to enjoy today. In short, a yes vote on question 1 is a responsible investment in what Brookline values: great schools, great teachers, and great town services.
Well done. Please.
We would like to thank the League of Women Voters for hosting tonight's debate and encouraging a discussion of the facts surrounding the override issue. I would also like to thank Rebecca and Neil for their continued service and dedication to the town. What you see before you tonight are 4 individuals with a common goal, all dedicated to maintaining the quality of schools in Brookline. Our goals are the same. You are witnessing a disagreement on the best way to achieve those goals, a disagreement on what the process should be, and finally, a disagreement on what should be the role of current elected officials in planning for the future of our community. This is not an argument about whether or not $10 or $40 a year in extra taxes are too much or too little. That's the wrong question, the wrong discussion. It's missing the forest through the trees. That our elected officials are choosing to frame the question in that manner is emblematic of the true underlying issue. This is a discussion about how this community should be allocating finite resources to meet the needs of all constituencies within the town. Make no mistake, the town of Brookline does not now, nor will it ever have, unlimited financial resources. This is a discussion about the obligation of elected officials to set priorities, to ask questions, and to demand answers. It is about whether the role of the school committee is one of advocacy or oversight. It is a discussion about accountability, about the obligation of our elected officials to make sure we get the biggest bang for our buck, whether that buck is spent on road repair, public safety, recreation, or yes, even education. To borrow a phrase from the private sector, this is about data-driven decision-making. The Override Study Committee was unanimous in its support for an override of $5 million. $5 million, the amount necessary to ensure all current programs are maintained at historic staffing ratios. $5 million, the amount necessary to ensure per pupil spending levels are maintained. The difference between the majority and minority reports was $2.9 million, approximately the same difference that we are discussing today. The cause of the difference is not due to the majority not wanting to support technology in the schools, nor is it because the majority does not want to adequately support students with special needs. Rather, the majority declined to support funding for those programs and initiatives for which the schools fail to provide data to support their claims, for those areas in which substantive questions were left unanswered. That is what we mean when we say they are asking to fund wants, not needs. The town's resources are not unlimited. We know for a fact in the next 5 to 7 years there will be significant capital requirements from the schools. Where will the money come from? How do we plan for that? We plan for that by making sure today's spending decisions give equal weight to cost considerations as to other factors. We plan for that by engaging in long-range financial decision-making. We plan for that by not being reactive but proactive. Starting today, in this override, we must establish these principles and establish these precedents as the guiding tenets of our financial decision-making. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carol. And Dick, you have last word.
Thank you. Good evening. I'm Dick Benka. By way of background, I was a selectman for 6 years, and I was chosen to co-chair the Override Study Committee. I took early retirement from my legal practice and passed the state certification exam in middle school math. For the past 9 years, I've been volunteering as a co-teacher and as a tutor at a charter public school in Boston, where the kids are 93% Black and Hispanic and 75% low income. I'm also the board president of a nonprofit nursing home. I cherish the value of education, but I also realize that money is not the answer to everything and that we have to balance the needs of all of the residents of our community, from young students to the most elderly. With that perspective, I have 3 major disappointments with the Selectmen's handling of question 1. First, as noted by Carol, the board did not require the schools to demonstrate the outcomes and efficacy of proposed expenditures. Second, the board hasn't provided residents with the complete long-term picture of future tax increases. And third, the board hasn't acknowledged the impacts on the middle class and on seniors. As to the long-term picture, the Selectmen and the Yes campaign present the overrides with trivialized incremental numbers. For those of you who are here and have the red handout, it's the top table on the handout that you have. To some, those look like one-time payments, $364 the first year, $86 the second, and so on. But those amounts never end. They get charged year after year, and they are cumulative. And the operating overrides are compounded, and you also have regular Proposition 2.5 increases and compounding. The second table on this red sheet shows the total impact. With just the proposed May 5th overrides, you're at tax increases of 20% in 4 years and 27% in 6 years. But that's not all. The schools are also planning 2 major projects: a major expansion and renovation of the high school, and a major K-8 project, including a possible new 9th school. With those projects and the associated operating costs, you're looking at tax increases of about 40% 6 years out. Now, the projects might get scaled back or delayed a bit, but on the other hand, interest rates are likely to rise in the future, and we might well not get state funding for multiple projects at one time, just like we failed with Driscoll. That would drive the numbers even higher than 40%. The likely magnitude of what is coming is daunting, and you can calculate your own tax impacts at our website, betterbrooklineoverride.com. Finally, I am so disappointed that the Selectmen didn't confront the impacts of tax increases on economic and age diversity in our town. Brookline is already becoming a community of the very wealthy. 3/4 of Brookline households with incomes below $75,000 are already under housing cost stress before further tax increases. That's true of 1/3 of senior homeowners and 2/3 of senior renters. There's a difference between somebody choosing to move to a downsized residence or a warmer climate and somebody being forced out. The campaign for a better override is not a no more taxes campaign. We say vote no on question 1, bring back a better, smaller override that is justifiable and that considers all the residents of Brookline. With regular Prop 2.5 increases and non-tax revenues, a better override would still increase the school department budget by 19 to 20% over the next 3 years, 2.5 times the
Dick.
projected enrollment growth.
Thank you, Dick.
Thank you.
I'm sure you'll have many other opportunities
Yeah,
to
thank
speak
you.
this evening. Just a quick reminder to those of us who are gathered here, and I hope you can hear me. I apologize. I've got a deep voice and a low mic. The green cards are how we're going to ask questions tonight. If you don't have one, there are 2 young women over here dressed in blue, actually 3, who have green cards and be happy to hand them to you. You can hand them back to them, and then they'll come up, and Margaret and I will read them. In the meantime, for the next 10 minutes, we are going to hear responses and a little bit of discussion back and forth between the 2 groups about what's been said so far. And we're going to start with those who are in favor, and you have 5 minutes between the 2 of you, so please apportion that, and as always, keep an eye on Lee's cards.
Okay. I'm glad to have a chance to correct a number of things that the No campaign continues to repeat here and in their materials. First, in order to imply that the needs of the schools are not as great as they are, they miscategorize both the enrollment growth and the budget growth on the school side by saying that enrollment growth is 25% and budget growth has been 44%. This is misleading. The enrollment growth has been exclusively at the elementary grades, and this has been more than 38% since 2006. As I said earlier, that growth begins to hit the high school next year. By 2024, the high school will have grown from this year's 1,900 students to about 2,600 students. That's extraordinary growth, and it means the need is real. On budget growth, to ensure apples-to-apples comparisons, you have to look from 2009, when we extended the school day, not 2006 as they do. But even then, per pupil spending has fallen even as the budget has increased. The Override Study Committee found that since 2009, inflation-adjusted spending per pupil has fallen by about 5.5%, even as the budget has increased. In inflation-adjusted terms, it's even lower than it was in 2006. Second, but even more important, the No campaign has built its whole message on the same tired idea that many anti-override campaigns use. Vote this down and force your town to offer you a lower number. In 2008, the opposition said exactly the same thing. I believe this is just a campaign slogan to get people to vote no. If theirs were a real alternative, the No campaign would have to admit all the scary cost scenarios about tax increases they're tossing around are almost exactly the same as their preferred override. They scare voters by saying that this override will mean a 40% cumulative tax increase over the next 6 years. But so will theirs, using the same assumption. The difference is barely more than 1 percentage point. The difference out of pocket for the median condo in 2009 is not even $40. So this is a mythical second lower override that isn't really good for anyone. It's pennies for taxpayers, while for kids it's $2 million a year. That's the elementary world language program. That's technology that actually belongs to the 21st century. That's 25 teachers. In fiscally responsible towns like Brookline with a AAA bond rating, overrides that are defeated are simply that, defeated. In Brookline, a no vote will mean notices to teachers on May 8th, elimination of courses at the high school, and class consolidations that affect the quality of education for our children next fall. No subsequent action will be able to undo that damage. It will mean cuts on the town side, too. No means no. What does the No campaign think Brookline should give up? Let's talk about what they said in the Override Study Committee report about possible savings. The OSC report from Group 1 shows exactly how the No campaign feels is wasteful spending. They'd only fund 40% of the ask for literacy specialists, while reading by 3rd grade is considered the national priority for all children. 40% of educator evaluation teams, even as we're implementing a mandated new educator evaluation plan. They would buy computers, but not fund the staffing and trainings so that those machines could actually be put to use. The Selectmen didn't reject Group 1's number because we didn't read the analysis. We just disagreed with a lot of the analysis. Finally, of course, we're all worried about what's happening with poverty in Brookline. Poverty rates are among those 65 and over did not go up significantly between 2000 and 2010, but that doesn't mean it's not higher than we want. Still, we have protections for low and fixed income seniors in terms of tax deferments and abatements. I worry about the rising poverty rate among our children. Between 2000 and 2010, poverty rates for those under 18 had the highest growth. What happens when Brookline has more kids living in poverty? The burden is taken up by our child-serving agencies, the principal one being the public schools. If child poverty in Brookline is going up and school enrollments are going up, this is not the time to starve the schools.
Thank you, Neil. All right. And Richard or Carol, please.
Thank you. We're hearing now the argument, there's only a small difference. We can't take the risk of the override failing. This is a prime example of the lack of foresight. Both ends of the political spectrum, Brookline PACs and the Coalition Against Unfair Taxation, urged the Selectmen to offer a choice, tracking the majority and the minority positions on the OSC, so we definitively know the outcome on May 5th. But the Selectmen made the decision not to offer voters that choice. So now it's said the town has to vote yes on the inflated override. That's just not true. It's a contrived crisis. The town clerk says that a new override can be on the ballot within 6 weeks. That would be June 23rd. Proposition 2.5 explicitly allows town meeting to pass a budget contingent on that vote. The responsible long-term thinking would be for the Selectmen to be planning now for the possibility of a no vote on May 5th and not saying, we can't do anything. There's been the suggestion that for political reasons, the Selectmen won't put the better override on the ballot until September, if they'll do it at all, when school families will be back. Again, that delay would be the board's decision and totally avoidable. Absentee ballots will be available whenever the election is held, and the better override would have no serious principled opposition. The only conceivable issue is the time gap created by the Selectmen's initial failure to put 2 options on the ballot and any further avoidable decision to delay another vote. Here, the superintendent has already said that he's dealt with potential critical staff losses by retaining elementary world languages in a no override budget. Regular retirements open up positions for other staff. The schools hire throughout the year. They even add and subtract sections during the summer and later. Moreover, there are substantial funds that would bridge any gap. Even under a no override budget, the schools are getting $3.9 million in additional funds next year. Of that amount, the superintendent's budget tucks more than $800,000 into additional reserve funds. Instead, some of those funds could go toward positions. Also, the schools have substantially more than $1 million in revolving fund surpluses on hand. In addition, the Selectmen and the schools can utilize non-tax revenues without any override vote. A potential $2.3 million has been identified. Moreover, the town has a reserve fund that's available to the school. And finally, the Board of Assessors has recently determined that there's a $1.1 million surplus in the town's overlay account. This can be called on at any time, and by it itself, it eliminates the need for any no override reductions. Let me touch on the argument that there's only a couple of $1 million difference between the May 5th override and the better override proposal. Every dollar will get compounded year after year under Proposition 2.5. Moreover, the lower amount, and importantly, the lower amount is the product of a rigorous, empirically based decision-making process. It is the first step in bringing sound, sustainable spending practices to the schools that will affect not only this override, but future budgets and overrides as well. If not now, when? $2 million is only a small part of spending on the schools. It's a little more than 1%, but it's about 2 times what we spend on seniors through the Council on Aging. It's half of what we spend on maintaining all of our open space. It's the debt service on half of a $60 million new school. It's the debt service on the acquisition of $30 million of open space. The real risk here is short-term thinking and saying, we can't do it. We can't have another override. The real risk is having to dismantle programs that get created with this override because we can't afford them in the future. The real risk is passing an excessive override now and not leaving the capacity for looming overrides that are on the horizon. Yes, even with the better override, there will be higher taxes, but at least we'll know that they're justified. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we're going to move into questions from the attendees, and Margaret and I will alternate, and we'll also alternate in terms of which side we begin with, and each side will have 3 minutes to respond to questions. Your choice as to who responds, and Margaret will begin. And let's begin with Neil and Rebecca.
So the first question that we were asked is, the town administrator's budget for 2016 to 20 has projections for income and expenditures, but they are not in the school budget book. Why not?
Income, I don't quite understand the question, but I'll try to answer. Income is recognized on the town, and then income is distributed to all the different departments as part of the budget process, and it goes through town meeting. I don't know how to answer that question.
I don't either. Can you repeat the question?
Yeah.
It was confusing.
These are questions just as we received them from the audience, so this is a lesson in town government, I guess. The question goes as follows. The town administrator's budget for 2016 to 20 has projections for income and expenditures, but they are not in the school budget book. Why not?
The school budget book, the school does its budgeting based on projections that we share with that the town shares with us through the town school partnership, and our budgets are based on the revenues that we are told are going to be available. So our budget book is based on those revenues. There's no need to repeat the town administrator's revenue projections.
And town revenues are recognized and estimated on the town side of the budget. So there's no need to duplicate it in the school budget. Do you have an answer, Dick?
Yeah, one possibility, and I'm not sure exactly what the exact discrepancy is, but there are a number of lines that could be called the school budget. There is the money that comes from the general fund. There's also town spending in support of the schools, which ranges from employee benefits to our DPW doing the grounds around the schools. That's another amount that's carried in the school budget book at the back in the superintendent's budget. Those are shown. And then the schools also recognize grants and things of that sort in their budget that wouldn't show up in the town's general fund budget going to the schools. So that could be a cause for some of the discrepancy. Let me add one other point. The budgeting or the forecasting that's been done here going forward and on which this override is based uses estimates of future revenues that the town expects to realize. And over the last 3 years, the estimates that the town estimates very conservatively. Over the last 3 years, the town has estimated revenues from 1 to 3 years going out. It's underestimated those revenues by anywhere from $3.5 to $9 million. So this override is based on extraordinarily conservative, I think, budget estimates, and that is something also that people should recognize.
Right, and that's why we have a AAA bond rating, and it's a good thing in this year that we've had extreme snow removal costs way in excess of our budget.
Thank you both very much. I think we'll move on to our next question, and we're going to begin with Richard and Carol. The next question, what will the immediate impact of the operation, if the operational override does not pass? What will be the immediate impact if the operational override does not pass? 3 minutes for Richard and Carol.
Well, I think I addressed that in my initial comments. The immediate impact, I think, will be minimal if the selectmen act responsibly. I think the selectmen should put another override on the ballot promptly, and that override should be approved by the voters. It should put a better justifiable override on the ballot. In the interim, as I indicated, there are substantial resources that can be used to bridge the gap. The schools have, even with no override at all, the schools will be getting $3.9 million more next year. Those would not be, there would not be cuts in the sense of the need to cut or budgets being reduced. They'd get $3.9 million more. Of that, they're proposing to put $800,000 into reserves. Those monies could be used for positions. They have $1 million plus in revolving funds. They have access to the town's reserve fund, and as I indicated, we've recently learned that there's $1.1 million in overlay funds, tax overlay funds, excess taxes that have been collected that will be available, that can be called on to bridge any gap.
Very well.
Yeah.
So no responsible business and certainly no responsible school committee would budget the way Dick has just described budgeting in a no override scenario. Furthermore, we have obligations, contractual obligations to our staff, which say that on May 8th, based on the no override scenario, which is, after all, the budget we are about to vote on tomorrow night in the schools, the override budget and the non-override budget. That non-override budget will be implemented the day after if this override goes down. We contract with our teachers. We tell them by law on May 8th whether or not their positions will be available to them next year. We plan the next school year for almost 8,000 students starting on May 8th. We are not going to wait for that. We can't by law, and we wouldn't anyway because it's not a responsible way to run a school system for 8,000 students. There will be teachers who will get noticed that their positions are gone. There will be decisions about class consolidations that will go into effect because those decisions have already been made and are waiting for the outcome of this election. There will be so the class consolidations, that has implications for class sizes. There will be courses that will not be offered at the high school next year, and that will go into effect on May 8th. The way you plan is based on the budgets you are offered. We were offered a no override scenario and an override scenario. Responsible budgeting requires that that's what we plan for.
Very good. Thank you very much. And Margaret will read the next question, and we will begin with Neil and Rebecca.
Thank you. The next question. This override seems unfair to seniors, people who have stopped working but want to stay in the town. Any provisions for seniors?
Yes, there are a number of provisions. There are a number of abatements that are actually income-based, and admittedly, the income limits are very low, but there are, I believe, about 150 seniors who are taking advantage of some of those abatements. There's also a tax work-off program. And lastly, there's a program that allows you to defer your taxes and not pay your taxes today, but when your house is sold or turned over, the tax liability would be covered at that point. So there are programs in place. there's interest. It's not a fine. It's the equivalent of a loan. I believe it's 5%.
5%.
It's in effect a 5% loan on your property taxes. So there's no reason for people to be thrown out of their houses. There are programs available.
This is really offering false hope. The standards are such that basically nobody in Brookline qualifies. You're disqualified from these programs if you have even a small amount of retirement savings. Under one program, you must be 70 or older with net worth, excluding the residence, of less than $54,000. And there you get $350 maximum off of your taxes. Under another program, you have to be 65 or older with gross income of less than $38,000 for a couple, $25,000 for an individual, and net worth of less than $42,000 or $58,000, including all your retirement savings. Last year, in both of these programs, according to the assessor's office, there weren't 150, there were 11 Brookline seniors who claimed exemptions worth a total of $6,200. In addition, the tax deferral program, you pay interest at 5%. There's a lien on your property. That 5% interest rate is more than a home equity loan at a commercial bank and more than interest on savings. It eats into what you can leave to your children and your grandchildren. Last year, only 10 Brookline seniors used this program. And more importantly, with respect to the exemption, people who need an exemption, even those few Brookline residents who get it, will still face the full brunt of the override tax increase because they're already qualified for and getting the exemption, and any additional taxes is an amount that they would have to pay even with that exemption. So the program for seniors really is illusory. It's offering false hope, and I think unfairly offering false hope to seniors.
Very good. Thank you very much. Okay, next question, and we'll begin with Richard and Carol. And there are a pair of questions. Actually, there are three. I'm going to read two of them right now, and then we'll try to get the third in a little bit later. The first one's easy, which is what is the tax increase in a percent, and sort of where we are now to what this override would do? What's the percentage increase for people? I'm assuming that's on average. And then the second question is, if this only gets us money to operate the existing system plus 5 new classrooms, can someone please explain what the future increases will be to fund an additional K through 8 and the high school? So please, Richard and Carol, you have 3 minutes.
Let me start with the percent of this increase. The Selectmen have calculated the percent of the operating override and the debt exclusion together at 6.1% additional taxes. The next question is what happens as we go down the road. Under Proposition 2.5, everybody's taxes increase by, according to the assessor, about 3.25% every year on the average or typical property. With those Proposition 2.5 increases and the increases in this debt exclusion and operating override, you'd be at approximately 27% increases by 2021, 6 years down the road. With the additional projects that are coming, the new K-8 school or major K-8 project and a major expansion and renovation of the high school, the reasonable projections that are on this sheet that has been distributed are 40% increases in 6 years, including the cost of the debt exclusion and the operating costs for both of those facilities. And as Neil indicated in his opening comments, those numbers are really, they might be a little higher or it might be a little lower, but those are the kinds of numbers that we are looking at down the road.
Thank you. And Neil and Rebecca, you have 3 minutes to
Yeah,
respond.
I would only add that under the ballot question versus what the no campaign is offering, the percentage differences would be one-ish, 1.2, 1.3% over time difference. And yes, we're looking at some additional building projects down the road. We don't know how much we will need debt exclusions for, but yes, they're coming, and we can be looking at additional tax increases under both scenarios. The dollars are not all that different.
Right, I would just add about that, as Neil says, nobody has ever said that we don't have these projects out there. We've been planning them and talking about them for years, and it's very important that we continue to do that planning realistically. That said, the only reason you put you don't put a debt exclusion on the ballot for a project that doesn't yet exist, because there's no way to estimate what the cost is, and that cost is done over time through a feasibility project that looks at the ability of the town to afford the project. Projects are scaled back when we can't afford to do them. So it's called value engineering. We're in the middle of doing that with the Devotion project. So a debt exclusion, yes, there will be debt exclusions for the projects. We don't know exactly how big they're going to be, and we are going to work very, very hard to make sure that they are the size that this town can support gladly. Operating overrides, as Neil pointed out, may be necessary if things don't break our way. They may not be necessary if things do break our way. There's lots of uncertainty out there, and there's no real way to project what's going to happen over the next 5 years in terms of state money, in terms of whether or not we do more on things like health insurance benefits, or what's going to happen in collective bargaining. So there's lots that could go our way, there's lots that could not go our way, and operating overrides may or may not be necessary. But again, projecting or trying to predict the size is a crystal ball that none of us have.
May I just add something to this discussion?
I think so.
Thank you. We do have some placeholders for these projects going forward. And the point of the No Override campaign is we do know the order of magnitude. These are not $10 or $20 million projects. We're talking about potentially easily an additional $200 million in the next 5 to 7 years that we'll need to be raising. And with those sorts of expenditures looming in the future, we feel it is incredibly important now to be very cost conscious and be concerned about what we spend today, so we will have the extra capacity moving forward. As Dick pointed out earlier, the difference between our override proposal and what's currently on the table would fund almost half of a new school. That's a lot of debt service, and we need to be talking about and making these sorts of trade-offs and decisions now. We need a long-range plan as to how we are going to be paying for new schools.
Thank you, Carol. Next question? We'll begin with Neil.
The next question relates to staffing in the schools, and on this one we start with Neil and Rebecca. The Low Override Study Committee group recommended not funding literacy and math specialists. Why do you think struggling students need less support when our achievement gaps are real?
Well, I think that question is not for me, because I do believe that our struggling students need more support, and that's exactly why we budgeted to put literacy and math specialists as a priority in the school's budget. The thing to understand about what we've been doing over the last several years, as we've been facing budget problems, but we were coming off of an override that we were committed to being responsible, to not going back, even though we were having budget problems and some growth problems immediately after the 2008 override. So what we've been doing is pouring our budget revenue dollars, our scarce dollars, into classroom teachers and essentially starving the perimeter. You put in classroom teachers because you want to keep class sizes small and you want to hire great teachers. Those are the two fundamental pillars of great education. And by putting our resources there, we have essentially been starving the perimeter, which is all of the supports that go around classroom teachers that support what they do with students. And that is math and literacy specialists. That is the psychologists and the guidance counselors and even the nurses. That is the perimeter of supports, and that's where we've been starving our system so that we could pour what resources we had as we grew into classroom teachers. The override essentially gives us the ability to support those perimeter supports, and it starts with really crucial staff like math and literacy specialists.
The argument that the schools made before the Override Study Committee was that funding was necessary to catch up with where staffing levels were before enrollment growth began. And the Override Study Committee examined those assertions and also listened to the school committee where they identified priorities. One of those priorities was literacy staff, and the majority did provide some funding for literacy staffing in response to those priorities identified by the schools. Math specialists were not identified in the same way as a priority, but obviously what the schools do with whatever funding they get is ultimately the decision of the school committee. And if the school committee believes that math specialists are more important than some of the other areas that they identified, such as administration or custodial staff, they certainly have the option to use the funding in that way.
May I make a clarification for the audience? Dick and I are not here defending a no override budget. We are very much supporting a base override amount of $5 million, which is really addressing a lot of those sorts of questions. We believe in doing these catch-ups for a lot of things. The difference between what we're supporting and what the higher override amount is not for these core services, is not for these classroom teachers. We are really focused on things that could not be substantiated and for which there was not quantification and data. We are not saying there should be no override. And I think we could probably have a more constructive conversation this evening if we can focus our comments on what the difference is and the long-range planning issues that we are trying to bring to the forefront of this discussion.
But how can we assume, if we put another override on the ballot, that's going to win? There's no such thing as a pro forma override ballot question. I've never heard of such a thing.
It's not my position that you should have no override.
You know, we're going to have time for...
May I respond to Neil's question?
You know
No,
what?
our position is that the override was
Carol.
not well-crafted.
Thank you, Carol. We're going to keep this section for the audience questions. The audience has been asked to bring questions forward. We have a stack, and they keep coming in. So there are things they're specifically interested. There will be closing comments. Please feel free to address these things in your closing comments. And we invite you also to, expand your responses to the questions that come up and use the questions that come up in ways that suit you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, so this is beginning with Richard and Carol. What will be the effect of a no override vote on our town's AAA bond rating, which allows us to borrow at lower rates? You have 3 minutes.
This was a discussion that was actually before the Board of Selectmen and I think the Advisory Committee yesterday, and the town's treasurer, Steve Cirillo, indicated that I think he did not give an opinion about what would happen with a no vote, but he did opine that if there were another override that passed, that there would be no effect on the town's AAA bond rating. Fair statement?
assuming we continue to follow our financial policies. and
Yeah,
all, yeah.
yeah, and just in response to Neil's question, which is actually pertinent to this, if there were a better override that were put on the ballot by the selectmen, which is their option to do within 6 weeks, according to the town clerk, there would be no principled, organized opposition to that. I certainly would not be involved in opposing that. Carol, I think, would not be involved in opposing that. We would support that override
We would work for it.
and would work for it.
Yes, please.
Yeah, our AAA bond rating is very important, especially as we head into a period where we're going to be going to the bond market. And we heard last night that Mr. Cirillo estimated that if we were to come down one notch, that could cost the town between $11 and $20 million over the life of a bond, and that's a lot of money. And that's why I'm concerned about some of the things I've heard about how we should alter some of how we look at contingencies, how we look at reserves, how we should use as a bridge to an override that may not pass should there be a no vote here, reaching into reserves and contingencies, and that's a complete violation of our policies, and it's a use of one-time monies for operating expenses, which is something that we never do, and the bond agencies would look really askance at. So I'm very concerned at those kinds of suggestions. And also, a key principle of prudent budgeting is conservative recognition of revenue, and we've been very successful in our budgeting practices, and I'd hope we'd continue that.
We are not suggesting you spend a year dipping into those reserves and things. What we're telling you is that for the slight chance that there is a few-week difference, you can cover with confidence those hiring decisions or those pink slip decisions that you're going to make, that you have the ability, the working capital to do that. That would not jeopardize your bond rating at all. And I know last year you did have a bridge budget, that you found some surpluses and reserves from various places. We are not suggesting you throw out your the positive aspects of your financial management plan at all. We're just telling you that you can find the working capital to bridge the few weeks and bridge the uncertainty between two override votes. And if the second override doesn't pass, then you're no worse than you are now with your planning for a no override. But we really don't think that will happen. You would get the support of everyone that currently is opposing this higher override.
But how can we take that to the bank?
How can you take what to the bank?
The fact that a second ballot question is going to pass.
What do you need to take to the bank? I don't understand. You aren't borrowing money in those 3 weeks, are
You
you?
know,
Or
But
those
we'd
6
be
weeks?
dipping
I'll just
into
tell you,
reserves.
we have several people who are actually worried about exactly that kind of thing, so there's going to be a question coming up that will
Okay.
invite this debate. But in the meantime, Margaret has another different kind of question.
She's not kidding that the pile of questions is tall. The next question is also school-related. The number proposed by the majority group of the Override Study Committee was based on a set of assumptions that the group said would need to be revisited as the situation changed. One of those assumptions was an incoming kindergarten class of 630. With the current kindergarten class now at 703, is that original number still sufficient?
Are we starting on this side?
Thank you. We're starting with Neil and Rebecca.
No, that number's not sufficient, and actually, that was a part of the conversation that was had with this Board of Selectmen as they were deliberating the override scenarios. So the proposals, what was really wonderful about what the Override Study Committee did, in addition to providing just an extraordinary fact base and amount of information on which to base budgeting, was that they developed a really sophisticated budgeting model that allowed for changes in assumptions and projected the outcomes and the needs that would be needed for the school's budget on the basis of those changes. And so when the selectmen were, and Neil can confirm this, when the selectmen were looking at the override scenarios and trying to figure it out, they were actually using the same budget model that the Override Study Committee used and agreed on. Of course, the Override Study Committee members came to different conclusions, but they were using the same fact base and they were using the same model, as did the Selectmen's Committee. So when the selectmen were informed that we had, again, more kindergartners than had been predicted. Now by 3 outside consultants have failed to predict accurately the future enrollment growth. And so they did adjust it, and the numbers went up accordingly. But again, because the Override Study Committee had provided recommendations, even though they were competing, one was about 65% of what the schools had projected their need would be. One was about 90% of what the schools had projected their need to be. So when the numbers were adjusted, that was simply, those percentages were just applied. So it was...
Rumor has it that we're down to 698, that we lost a few kindergarten students, and I understand that enrollment...
Are you saying to me that we've lost 5 students?
Rumor has it. Rumor has it.
Congratulations. I'm sure we know where they are.
And we understand that enrollments are running a little bit behind where they were last year, so that's certainly some relief. And of course, predicting just 1 year out what your enrollment's going to be is incredibly difficult. And you know, we don't fault any of the consultants that you've hired over the years, the difficulty in doing that. But changes and variability in the enrollment is just a fact of life. And if you look over the last 30, 40 years at communities around the country, you'll see that their enrollments have gone up and down. And of course, the challenge for the school system and the challenge for the town is going to be, what level of enrollment do we plan for? What we would hate to see happen is what happened to many communities around the country in the 80s, where they ended up mothballing and taking out of service schools that were built to service the baby boomers. Now, we don't know what level enrollment will plateau at, but at some point it will plateau. And at some point, guess what? It might even fall. And we need to be having some serious long-range conversations about how we manage the variability in enrollment, because that will be happening. The variability will continue.
And happily, we are having those conversations and have been having them for many, many years. The reason we have contingencies in our budget, as Dick was referring to earlier, is because there is variability. It's because things happen that we're not expecting. It's because we plan for 630 students and get 700.
May I actually add a comment? Thank you. This year's kindergarten class is a very large one. The superintendent has reported that based on the initial enrollments at this point, he expects the incoming kindergarten class to be smaller again. The Better Override campaign recognizes the size of the kindergarten class, and that's why, as we're talking about numbers here, we recognize that the $5 million figure that the majority of the Override Study Committee came up with has to be adjusted upwards. And we're not arguing that it should be a flat $5 million.
I know this is exciting, Carol.
No, I
Rebecca.
just have to correct something, because the superintendent has reported to the school committee that the enrollments that we've been getting for kindergarten next year are tracking lower, largely, they believe, because of the snow that interfered with the system of enrolling, but what it's tracking is pretty much where we are, not lower.
Thank you, Rebecca. Okay, now, beginning this time with Dick and Carol, I'm going to read 2 questions. They're about the same subject. The first is, I have a daughter in the Brookline schools. Can you guarantee that there will be another override and that it will pass? And this other one says, another override vote. The No campaign claims that we can have a new vote about a month after the May 5th election should question 1 lose. The Yes campaign says September at the earliest. Both campaigns are led by selectmen, current or former. What gives? When could we vote again? Should question 1 lose? And what happens to school staff in the time between the votes? So, Richard and Carol, you have this question. I think this invites the discussion you were after.
Sure. Under Proposition 2.5, the requirement is that the selectmen put an override vote to have an override vote, put it on the ballot. They file that with the town clerk, and that election can be held 35 days after that happens. Our town clerk has said that he could have an election 6 weeks after the May 5th override vote. If the override fails on May 5th, that would be June 23rd. So under state law, the ballot can be as early as June 23rd. What I have heard is that the idea of putting it on the ballot in September would be to ensure that school parents would be back. That would be a decision that the selectmen would make. The timing of this is and would be up to the selectmen. And as both Carol and I have said, there would be no organized opposition to a better override. And whether it would be in June or it would be in September, or it would be sometime over the summer with people voting absentee, or it would be after that, both of us would support a more moderate, more responsible, better override.
So we've just heard the theory, now there's the practice. In Brookline, we have an open, transparent budgeting process. Our meetings are subject to the open meeting law. All our discussions take place in public. And I've never seen a budgeting process in Brookline that we have a failed override and poof, a new number gets put on the ballot and budgets are based on that. What I foresee happening is a period of analysis, a period of discussion, a period of public hearings. That's how a responsible AAA community goes about doing this kind of thing. I looked at other AAA communities that have had failed overrides, then brought back another number. And the quickest a community has done that was Needham about 13 years ago, where they had a failed override and they brought back another number in 5 months. Now, I don't know if it would take that long, but I would expect there to be a discussion, a process, and then a decision, and that's the way we would responsibly handle that.
I would also add that you can't budget when there is no budget from which to plan. So the idea that we would simply accept a no vote on the promise that there will be another override for an amount that asks us to cut another $2 million from the school's budget, which we've already said would be incredibly damaging and probably result in many of the same cuts that we are saying for next year anyway. We don't have a budget to operate from if this override goes down. There is no budget. So part of the process, part of the responsible process that Neil was just talking about, includes actually creating a budget, but creating a budget requires having a number specific to what that budget is operating with. That takes a long time to be done responsibly. Again, it cannot be done at the same time that we are planning a school year for almost 8,000 students. That school year would be planned based on the no override budget.
Can I just provide one clarification in terminology?
Do they have time left, Lee?
She's 1 minute.
Okay.
Okay, and that's the use of the word cuts. As Dick pointed out earlier, even under a no override scenario, the school budget is growing next year. So the term cut may confuse some of you in the audience. We are not talking about reducing the school budget to a number less than what it is this year. That is not going to happen, even if no override passes. No matter what, this town's school budget will be higher next year than it is this year. The question is how much higher? And there's three possible numbers. The no override increase, the question one increase, or something in between, which is what Dick and I are supporting. But next year's
Thank you,
budget.
Carol. Thank you. Thank you very much. All right, so Margaret has our next question, and we will begin with Neil and Rebecca.
The panel may feel that they have really already addressed this question, but it's important to ask it because it comes from Brookline High School students. As students at Brookline High School, we have already seen the impacts of the current budget issues. Next year, there will be an AP Calculus class with 31 students. There will be one teacher trying to help 31 students with one of the hardest classes in the school. This is happening next year. The quality of education will be decreasing next year. It has already started in overpopulated classes. There's no time to debate and create a new override. How do you propose to address this issue?
Well, unfortunately, that's a very well-put question and exactly the scenario that is the problem we are facing without the ability to put teachers in place and to keep them in place for all of the courses that are offered. So one of the things that we're looking at the high school next year is a reduction in course offerings. There will simply be fewer courses offered. Some of the things that students this year are looking forward to taking will not be offered because we won't have the staff to cover them as the numbers start going up. We think very carefully about having the staff to be able to continue programs such as the tutorial, which is a regular education service to students who are having some trouble in classes. They're not on an IEP, they're not getting special education. Tutorial is for the students who need extra help. And our teachers are there, our regular teachers are there. They put in one of their courses that they're required to do in the tutorial room, helping all students with that help that they need. Again, that's a wraparound service that we are able to provide that we will not be able to provide at the same level for students if we can't hire the teachers that we need to keep up with the enrollment. So the answer is that that's exactly the problem we are facing, and we are hoping very much that the town is sympathetic to that and invests, as we always have in the past, as we certainly did in 1994 and 2008, in giving us the ability to provide the teachers for the students that we will have at the high school.
I can't address the AP program and the specific staffing levels at the high school. I can reiterate that no matter what, next year's budget will be going up by at least $3.9 million over what this year's is. But what came to mind hearing that question was something that happened when my children were in elementary school at Runkle, and we had a new principal come in, and he went around and he had coffees with all the parents. And I think my youngest was in first grade at the time, and one of the parents said, "Why aren't you teaching our students, our children, how to read time on a regular watch?" And he looked at us and he said, "You know, the school day isn't getting any bigger, and we're going to have to make decisions about what we teach and how we approach things." Now, I don't know if a large AP math class is good or bad, but I do know that there's a limited pot of money, and we have to make decisions as to how we allocate our financial resources among the town's different needs and among the educational program's different needs.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So we'll begin this question with Dick and Carol. And I'm going to combine a number of questions that I've received. People are deeply concerned about what happens to the school budget if this fails. And so I'm going to describe some of the things they're concerned about, and you could address a variety of these. I have a special needs student going into the 4th grade. I'm concerned about class sizes. What will happen to class sizes if the override doesn't pass, and if it does pass? Without the Selectmen's override, what will happen to the ECS, Gifted and Talented program? And what will happen to the World Language program in the lower grades, which will better enable our kids to function effectively in the global economy? And then here, specifically addressed at you, Dick and Carol, although of course both of you will have the chance to answer the question, what do you see as the cuts that will come if you remove the $2 million that you're talking about removing by replacing your override with the override that's currently proposed? So if you would address that array of questions, that was gifted and talented, world languages, special needs class sizes and class sizes overall, and then what's your $2 million aimed at?
The majority of the Override Study Committee funded all requests for special education. The majority of the Override Study Committee funded the Enrichment and Challenge program and an expansion of that program. The majority of the Override Study Committee funded the maintenance of the elementary world language program. There were no cuts under the majority of the Override Study Committee to any existing programs, and indeed there were expansions of programs, including ECS and Steps to Success, which is the program that benefits students who are living in public housing and are in the Brookline school system. So under a better override, all of these programs would be funded. There would be funds to fund these. Now, what's happened, ironically, is that the superintendent of schools has said, if there isn't, if there's no override at all, I'm going to have to cut ECS, the Enrichment and Challenge program. In a year, I'm going to get rid of elementary world language and so forth. That is not what we're suggesting, and the no override budget is not what the Better Override campaign is supporting. So these cuts in these programs are things that the superintendent has identified if there's no override at all, but that's not what we're talking about.
So I'll just reframe that second part of that question, because you've answered part of it, but I think we've missed the second part, which is, which elements are specifically not included then in your proposal that would be included in the other ones?
Of the ones that are identified.
No, not of those, of my list, but just which elements, what are the top three things, for instance, that would be, not be in your proposed override that would be in the current proposed override?
Ultimately, the decision about what to fund and where to allocate funds is a decision of the school department and the school committee. What the Override Study Committee looked at were the justifications for the requests that the school committee made. And for example, one of the issues, one of the primary issues was the issue of coordination between the town and the schools with regard to technology staffing. And there has been a 2002 memorandum of agreement which is not being followed. The Override Study Committee indicated that it would be critical to coordinate staffing on issues regarding technology, regarding implementation of technology, regarding infrastructure, regarding the help desk. And the majority of the Override Study Committee said, if we get this staffing, and if we get this governance plan and this organizational plan, we would fund the staffing. The town administrator and the superintendent, both in their fiscal year 15 budget messages, which goes back to February and March of 2014, said, this is something that we have to resolve, and it still hasn't happened. That's an example.
Very good. Thank you very much. You have 3 minutes, Neil and Rebecca.
So, all due respect, Dick, the the Override Study Committee, Group 1, was saving things like that you mentioned, like the ECS program, at the expense of literacy specialists, at the expense of teacher innovation funds, at the expense of occupational therapists, physical therapists, speech therapists, the very regular ed interventions that the Override Study Committee also admitted saved the schools money and congratulated the schools on investing in as efficiencies. So if you're going to starve the things that we're doing well in order to fund the things that you don't want to be tarred with having suggested we should cut, I don't think that's really responsible, and that's not the way we're going to do it. You would also not have increased math specialists. The list goes on and on about what would not have been funded in order to make the kinds of cuts that Group 1 was going to make, which is why the Selectmen looked at the recommendations and suggested that we needed the more money that you were suggesting that we cut. It's not responsible to budget that way for kids.
Let me say just a word about the technology program. The Group 1 recommended purchasing all the devices that were recommended, but the monies not be expended until certain certain programs were in place that would support the devices. So they said, okay, we'll fund it, but we want some things to happen. With respect to staffing, they said, well, we don't think we should fund it at all until certain things, governance packages in place, and then they didn't put the money in the override. So there's no mechanism to put the money in the override. I would have been more sympathetic if the recommendation was, yes, you need to put the governance in place. Yeah, we'll put the money there, but it shouldn't be expended until the governance is in place. So what we have is kind of the worst of all worlds. We have the devices are funded under their proposal, but the staffing and the training and the ability to incorporate it into the curriculum is not funded, and that was something that we disagreed with.
Do they have additional time? Okay, very good. All right, next question then. Margaret. And we'll start with Neil Overbeck.
This is two related questions, and they really are related to your recent comments, having to do with technology. My child goes to Pierce School. Currently, there are not enough computers and tablets, and the children need to take turns doing their work and research. How will the override change this? The second question, please explain technology. What exactly would be bought for which students? How many devices, things? What is the cost?
You can all cheer because I'm not actually going to walk you through the 200-page technology plan that was put out for the next several years with the schools. But the issue of students not having enough computers or other devices, laptops, tablets and those things at the schools is exactly what the technology plan and the money that the override provides it would be addressing. That is the first thing. The technology plan and the money that's in the override is fundamentally to bring us onto the information superhighway, which is a term that most of you will not associate with the 21st century, because the information superhighway was what we were talking about at the end of the 20th century. As we come into the 21st century, to be talking about doing an infrastructure that will get us onto that highway gives you a sense of just how far behind we are in our technology in the schools. One of the ways we are behind is in equity. We are committed to equity in terms of access to technology. We do not have that now. We heard loud and clear, especially from some of our African American scholars and students who belong to the Minority Student Achievement Network, who work with the Brookline schools to tell us where we can be doing better, both for minority students but also for low-income students. And one of the things that they talked about was their access to the technology that is increasingly being used in all of our classrooms, including in the elementary schools, not just in the high school. They do not have equal access. At some of our schools, our PTOs have really stepped up, and we have better technology at some schools than at others. And we appreciate what the PTOs have done. It's an extraordinary benefit. But our school equity in our schools cannot be based on the largesse of different parents in different neighborhoods. That's why we have money in the technology plan to make sure that we have equitable distribution of devices across the schools. That's why we have plans in the technology plan to talk about whether or not students actually have access to the internet at home on an equitable basis. That's not something that we have direct access to, but we are working very closely with the Housing Authority, for example, to make sure that students in public housing have access to the internet so that when and if we are able to give them access to the devices so that they won't necessarily have to share at home with 16 other people, that they can actually use those devices to go online to do the work that's been put there for them. So equity is all about the technology plan, and the technology plan is all about equity, and it starts with the devices in the schools.
Thank you very much. 3 minutes, Richard and Carol.
We share your concern about equity and access to devices, and we support fully funding of the acquisition of devices. And our budget does fully fund the acquisition of devices. And this issue of equity between the schools is something that certainly 15 years ago when my children were at Runkle was an issue. We were raising money to buy laptops. That's separate, though, from our concern about the poor coordination among the multiple IT departments and tech support departments within the community, within the town, within the schools. I think if we're spending this money on hardware, and if we're talking about taking this community forward into the 21st century, it really behooves us to have the appropriate organization to exploit these devices, and having duplication of efforts just doesn't make sense. We really need someone looking at a large, big picture and looking for efficiencies in how we utilize these things and how we roll services out. And we had a significant concern because technology devices, even though the prices have dropped, this is not a small line item. This is a real investment. And we want this investment done well, and we want technology professionals very much involved in both how it's done and how it's serviced.
It was certainly the hope of the majority of the Override Study Committee that the coordination between the town and the schools would be something that was worked out, and that still is an open issue.
It's in process. Yeah, go on.
I was just going to say...
You two were at stop, so actually they have 1 minute?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay,
So,
1 minute
so
it is.
first of all, there is not poor coordination. I'm sorry. Was
No,
that for
that's-
us or for them?
I think I've got the mic.
Yeah.
The, both the superintendent and the town administrator have recognized the need to coordinate the efforts of these multi-million-dollar departments. And that work is still unresolved 20 months later. And that is one of the concerns that the majority of the Override Study Committee had, and that is one of the issues that remains.
Do Neil and Rebecca have time as well? Do what? Does the pro... If you want to give it, Okay, can you keep it to as
Certainly.
briefly as possible?
The coordination is not poor. You can talk to the town administrator, you can talk to the superintendent of schools, you can talk to the CIO. It's not a problem of coordination. The problem with the budget being cut and only funding devices is that our teachers have to have the support to know how to use those devices. We are not talking about putting laptops in the hands of people and just saying, go, do, be wonderful, be one with the internet. That's not the way educational technology works. You have to train people, you have to coordinate that. We are all for coordination, but that's not what we're talking about here. We are talking about giving training to people so that they can take advantage of the new applications and the new educational technology, so they actually put the power of that technology in students and teachers' hands.
Thank you,
and don't
Rebecca.
just sit there with it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, next question, beginning with Richard and Carol. The question is about the amount per student spending. The Override Study Committee says the per-student spending has declined since 2009. Why do people say they were wrong? The No campaign says it has gone up. Someone confused about the statistics? And 3 minutes.
There are several ways of measuring per-student spending. What the Yes campaign is saying is that per-student spending has dropped. The Override Study Committee looked at numbers that included the impact of savings on the town side from our entering the GIC, which is a less expensive health insurance program, and also refinancing debt. When you include those elements, essentially lower payments to third parties, to bondholders and to health insurers, over the period from 26 to 2014, spending went down. On the other hand, if you look at actual educational spending, which is the school budget that excludes that, per student spending went up. And just to compare the two numbers, between 26 and 2015, the overall, and we have an overall budget for our schools. We don't have a budget for the elementary schools. We have an overall school budget. The school population went up 25%. The total spending in the school budget plus spending on behalf of schools went up 44%. The school budget itself, which is the educational spending, that's, the teachers in place and programs and so forth, not including the payments to third parties, that went up 50%. That went up double the amount that enrollment went up over that time period. Even adjusted for inflation, that amount went up.
I think we're running into, one of the problems I think all of us have kind of understanding what's going on here is agreeing on a set of facts. So we use the Override Study Committee report as the agreed set of facts, and I think that's what one of the things the Override Study Committee was trying to do. And on page 43 is the statistic that I quoted. It doesn't have the qualifications that Dick is describing.
So
It's complicated.
It's not that complicated. Revenues had been going up because revenues go up. Budgets go up over time. That's normal. That's going to go on happening, override or no override. In 2006, our per pupil expenditures were, I can't even remember what the number is, it's not off the top of my head. Here's what happened. In 2008, we added 100 minutes to the school day. We added a new program in elementary world language. The cost per student went up after the 2008 override because we had those infusions of budgets in the budget to provide those extra services and that extra time in the schools. Subsequent to that, as our enrollments went up and we were controlling costs and cutting back, the cost per student came back down. And in 2014, the cost per student was actually lower than it was in real dollars, inflation adjusted, in 2006. The No campaign keeps on telling you to compare with 2006 and to look at what's grown, and they fail to point out that a huge reason the budgets went up was because we passed an override for that extension of the school day and for the elementary world language. It was perfectly appropriate, but in terms of controlling costs, you look at per student cost, they have come down over time, which is what happens when your revenues do not keep up and your enrollments are growing.
So the numbers are, looking at 26 when enrollment growth started, and 2014 with the Proposition 2.5 growth, with tax growth, with the overrides that have been passed by this town. If you look at student spending, including the savings on the GIC and debt refinancing, per student spending went down by $478. If you exclude those and the savings essentially of money going to third parties, per student spending went up $614 over that period.
Thank you all very much. On to our next question, and we'll begin with Neil and Rebecca.
This question takes a different turn and talks about the effect of Proposition 2.5. How much of this debate is the result of Proposition 2.5 having created an artificially low expectation of future costs of public services? How can Brookline avoid becoming the victim of its own success? Is there a natural limit to school population growth? And can residential tax rates ever keep pace with the costs of serving an expanding population?
It's funny, I didn't see the superintendent in there to put a question in, but I take that all as a rhetorical question. We cannot predict reasonably where enrollment growth is going to go. We have a pretty good idea of where it's been, and we know that it hasn't stopped going up. So we have a sense of the direction. And now I'm losing the specifics of the question.
2.5.
Oh, so Proposition 2.5. So no, obviously there is a limit. I think it's the reason Brookline tried to vote against Proposition 2.5, despite the fact that the rest of the Commonwealth voted for it. So obviously we are limited, and when enrollment growth goes up and you are limited by Proposition 2.5, there is almost always at some point going to be a structural deficit, which is why you see public systems in states that have passed restrictions like this having trouble with their public schools. Look at California with Prop 13, look at Massachusetts with Prop 2.5. One of the wonderful things about Brookline was that in 1980, when Prop 2.5 passed, and we knew that this would be a problem for our public schools, we didn't go after a pipe dream of getting it repealed. Instead, a group of residents got together and created the first education foundation in the nation, called the Brookline Education Foundation, because they knew that Proposition 2.5 was going to structurally limit the ability of the schools to invest in things like professional support and innovation and the kinds of things that keep great teachers coming to towns like Brookline, the freedom to experiment, the freedom to grow as professionals. So that's the way we have responded. We've also responded with incredibly rigorous and careful budgeting and investments, strategic investments where we can in improving the services to our kids. But yes, the structural problem is there and remaining.
My understanding of part of the history, at least, of Prop 2.5 was that there used to be multiple taxing authorities in a community, which resulted in taxes being increased by whoever was responsible for increasing school taxes and community service taxes. And the situation was really getting out of control, and that's why 2.5 came about, and that's why this override mechanism came in. So yes, it does create challenges. Now, one of the hats I wear in my voluntary activity is I sit on the Economic Development Advisory Board. And the purpose of that board is to try and promote economic development here in Brookline, to expand the commercial tax base, to increase the amount of revenue that's available for the town. So there's a multi-prong approach to dealing with the financial constraints facing the community. We look for ways to broaden the tax base, increase tax revenues. We also look at non-tax revenues, there were a number of recommendations that the Override Study Committee made, which have not exactly been enthusiastically embraced. One of them was to raise the parking meters by 25 cents, I think it was for an hour. That could raise a substantial amount of money. And really questioning our approach to budgeting and fiscal discipline. So it's a multi-prong approach to deal with the revenue constraints imposed by Prop 2.5.
And Prop 2.5 does impose a certain amount of financial discipline on the town, and I think the town has been successful in its financial discipline, evidenced by the fact that we've only had 2 operating overrides in the last, since Proposition 2.5 has been enacted. This is the 3rd. We try to live within our means. In this case, we have an extreme circumstance of population growth in our schools, which outstrips our ability to grow the school budget, and that's why we're here today.
So I'm,
Yeah, do I have 30 seconds? 30 seconds. Great. I would just add that funding, for example, the non-tax revenues were options and funding sources that were identified by the Override Study Committee that have not been implemented to this point. Those are not one-time funds. Those are ongoing, perpetual funds, and that is a source of revenue that could be used by the
And there are plans for implementing much of what the Override Study Committee recommended.
And some of those revenue
Yeah, 2.3 million.
ideas were also for the schools, regarding the use of the school buildings by outside organizations.
which I might add, the schools have implemented a number of those recommendations, which we took seriously and actually adopted. We are now charging fees for outside groups to use the schools, which was not a popular thing for us to do, and we did it anyway because it was a reasonable expectation, and we put it into place. We've also raised fees in other places, and will continue to do so if necessary.
Thank you. All right, and I'm going to blend these 2 questions as well. These both have to do with Metco. You've saved that rather than programs becoming cut, domino effect with the root of the problem being the override not being passed, you said programs would be enriched. However, without the budget override, the program Metco, which buses kids living outside of Brookline to all K through 8 and Brookline High School, Metco provides diversity and a colorful learning environment. The cuts and budgeting of this program in our schools is detrimental. How would you propose to increase school diversity? And I apologize to the writer of the question for not catching that first word. And the second one, if the override doesn't pass, what do both sides think should happen to Metco, keep or cut? And we're beginning with Richard and Carol.
I'm not sure I totally understood the first part of the question, but I'll do my best.
So the first one was basically valuing that, how you keep diversity if it's going to end up cut. And I think that's partly the assumption that without an override, there's going to be pressure, and they're assuming that one of the things that might end up on that list is the...
What I know is that we just want to make sure that any discussion that this community has about diversity and Metco includes 2 things. One is that in addition to the diversity that Metco provides, and yes, it does provide diversity, there is socioeconomic diversity within the schools currently for residents of Brookline. And we would like to, we want to make sure that's recognized and valued. and that we don't jeopardize, we don't push out the middle class, we don't push out our teachers, nurses, social workers, families who earn their living that way for the sake of other programs. And any discussion of METCO, we need to acknowledge the fact that there is a cost to educating those students. Doesn't mean that we shouldn't be doing it, but any conversation needs to recognize that there is a cost. It's approximately $7 million. That may be a very fine priority for this community to spend that $7 million. We can say that that's what we want to do, but what we shouldn't be doing is having a conversation in which we say there's no cost to the METCO program. There is. Let's just be honest about it and accept the fact that there's a cost, and we'll discuss, as we're making all our trade-offs for the budget. That's just one more discussion to have. But we support METCO. We are not against METCO. We'd like to see METCO continued. We'd like the state legislature to provide more METCO funding. It's really too bad that doesn't happen.
I would just add one other point. And first, let me just clarify that $7 million figure is basically all non-resident students, which is METCO and materials fee. Of that, METCO is about 3/5 in terms of the cost to the town of the METCO program. The other factor is that was identified. Both school and METCO policies provide that non-resident students should be admitted on a space available or seat available basis. And in fact, what has happened is that non-resident students are admitted before we know the number of incoming resident students we'll have in that year. METCO students, for example, in kindergarten, materials fee students have already been admitted into kindergarten for the coming year. So the written policies that both METCO promulgates and that the schools promulgate regarding non-resident students, that they will be admitted on a seats available basis or a space available basis, are not in fact what we are doing at this time. And there is indeed a cost to that when we are in a situation where we are looking for capacity for all of the kids in our system.
So I appreciate the support for METCO that Carol just described, and I just wonder if the support for METCO and for not cutting it exists, then why the no override campaign keeps on pointing out how expensive it is and how we don't apparently allocate the students appropriately. So either we support METCO or we don't. We do support METCO in the schools. We support it hugely. And during the Override Study Committee's investigation of it, they had a very, very rich and robust and long conversation about METCO and about the costs. And we appreciate, the school committee totally appreciates that the Override Study Committee actually put a specific cost on it. We've always known that METCO did not pay for itself, but we thought that the value of METCO was not just the amount of money that we get per student. The value of METCO goes way, way beyond the amount of money that we get to run the program. In particular, we heard, and as has been reflected in the conversations about race throughout this country in the last months and years, that same conversation goes on in Brookline. How do you convey to people that they belong? How do you convey to a student in a school that is still predominantly white that they have a place, that they are included, that they are as much a student in Brookline as anybody else? And one of the ways we do that in Brookline is by making sure that our resident students of color are not the only student of color sitting in a classroom. And the way we do that is with the METCO program. So yes, we could cut back on the METCO program and save a couple of dollars maybe over time, but the price and the cost to the success and the comfort of our students of color would be just enormous. And that is, we do METCO not because of the amount of money we get for it, but because of the value we place on it.
Thank you both very much. And that was our last? 8:45. Yes, that was our last question and our last response from you, except we left time for final statements. And we have allocated 5 minutes for closing statements for each of the pair of you, so you'll need to work with each other to identify who speaks for how long. And we're going to start with Dick and Carol.
Dick has
you have-
graciously given me his
So you
entire
have-
5 minutes.
You have 5 minutes, and then so does the closing side.
Thank you. While preparing my concluding remarks for this evening, I received an email from the consulting firm McKinsey & Company. It contained an article from Lawrence Fink, the CEO of the investment firm BlackRock, the world's largest, with over $4.5 trillion under management. Titled Our Gambling Culture, the article discusses the perils of short-termism. Short-term thinking, he writes, pervades our most important institutions, from government to households. If we're going to meet our commitments to our children and grandchildren, he continues, and to society as a whole, we need to open up the lens and start taking a more responsible, longer-term view of the challenges we face. This evening, we have attempted to open up the lens of the discussion surrounding the proposed override. We have asked both you, the voters, and our elected officials to start taking a more responsible, longer-term view about what it means to maintain the quality of public education in Brookline. We have reminded you that with every choice there is a cost, and that those costs must be weighed against both potential educational outcomes and other competing town needs. We have differentiated between expenditures whose outcomes and benefits have been clearly defined and quantified, and those expenditures for which questions about outcomes and benefits remain unanswered or vague. We have clarified that it is the absence of those answers which defines for us the difference between wants and needs. Finally, we have introduced you to the idea of data-driven decision-making. No, children are not widgets, but neither educational organizations nor local governments are exempt from the principles of prudent, long-term financial decision-making. As parents, we are all faced with the question of how we will pay for our children's college educations. For the most fortunate among us, family resources allow this to be a non-issue. But for the majority of parents, it involves a series of decisions and trade-offs. Some will hope for athletic or merit scholarships. Some will forgo vacations or new cars to fund college savings accounts, while others will just shrug their shoulders, hoping it will work out somehow and figuring there are always loans. Like most families, the town of Brookline does not have infinite resources. The town must make a series of decisions and trade-offs. Those decisions and trade-offs must be in the context of the cost of providing all town services, of meeting all town capital requirements, not just for fiscal year 2016, but for the next 5, 10, and 15 years to come. $100+ million, the current placeholder for the renovation of Brookline High. $50 to $75 million, the placeholder for the cost of a 9th elementary school. $10 to $15 million, the operating placeholder for additional staffing. Short-term thinking will not ensure that today's elementary school students receive a quality high school experience. Short-term thinking does not mean the younger siblings of today's kindergarten students will have a quality elementary school education. What does long-term thinking sound like? It includes lots of questions. How much will this cost? How much can we afford? How much should we spend, and what are our priorities? Or enrollment isn't growing, but at some point it will plateau or even fall. How can we make sure we don't overbuild? The state just turned us down for one building project, Driscoll. Should we be assuming they'll be receptive for the next? Lawrence Fink concludes his article by asking, how do we fight back against short-termism? His answer, more communication and leadership. As I turn the microphone over to Neil and Rebecca, I ask you to listen carefully to what they say. Listen as your elected leaders, here as override proponents, present their concluding remarks. Listen carefully. Listen for the long-term context for their positions. Listen and hear if they have a long-term plan on how to pay for all of the town's services. Or, like some parents faced with college costs, are they shrugging their shoulders and counting on more tax overrides and loans? Thank you.
Thanks to everyone for being here tonight, and especially for staying through to the end, those of you who are still with us. Let me say what many of you have heard school committee members say recently. Lots more families wanting to come to school in Brookline is a great problem to have. It's great because Brookline has great schools and great town services. That's why people of all ages love living here. It's why families move here. We hear that all the time, to give their children a high-quality education. It's why our property values are high, because we invest in education and in our town. We invest in the future. That is a long-term view. So it's great, but it's still a problem. Still, everyone agrees that we need an override, and everyone agrees why we need an override. As you've heard many times tonight, our elementary school population is up by more than 38%. Over the long term, that's going to get higher. With that growth, we watched our kindergarten numbers climb, first to 500, then to 550, then to 600, then to 650, this year to 700. Next year, we are expecting about the same. But at the same time we were watching those numbers grow, we were facing budget constraints. There was something called the Great Recession. There were huge cutbacks in public education funds. Nothing could be more data-driven than our planning for this extraordinary growth. But because the growth followed on the heels of our 2008 override, each year that we have been sensitive to the promise to the voters that in Brookline overrides are rare because we are prudent, because we take a long view, because we look over time at what we can do. So each year the schools have cut back in some way. As some of you may remember, in 2009, we did that by eliminating library assistants. Today, our school libraries are not open as long into the day as we'd like because those positions have not been brought back. Under this override, those positions will still not be able to be brought back. This deficit was not caused by mismanagement or inefficiency or a failure to take the long view. Millions of dollars of efficiencies have already been squeezed out of the budget since the last override. Lots of thoughtful, careful, and difficult cuts have been made. We have, as you've heard, postponed investments in some upgrades in curriculum and technology to balance the budget. We even debated charging for full-day kindergarten and eliminating the enrichment and challenge support. For 2 years, we were told to create bridge budgets by the town to hang on to those programs at least minimally until there could be an override so that we could do them right. Where we have successfully invested is in making sure that the two pillars of excellence, great teachers and smaller class sizes, were preserved. We have hired classroom teachers to keep up with the burgeoning demand. But to do that, as I said earlier, we had to starve the perimeter. The circle of supports around classrooms and teachers, guidance, specialists in math and literacy, nurses for increasing numbers of children with chronic medical challenges, psychologists. And our education quality is now suffering from having these supports worn so thin. We have been underinvesting in new educational developments, and no surprise, our student test scores, which had been climbing over the last decade, have flattened out. In terms of space, even with successful projects to expand Runkle and Heath, our buildings have had to be carved up to make more rooms. We've actually added 50 classrooms in our schools over the same amount of time. We are on the road to creating more space, but that starts with the Devotion Project, does not end there. As I've talked to members of the community, I've heard a common refrain that some folks are dissatisfied, certainly with the weather, maybe with the decisions of the school committee, the superintendent, the Board of Selectmen. I've heard that some people feel that these disappointments should be funneled into a no on the override to express their dissatisfaction. The problem is, the message that will be sent if you vote no on May 5th is not that you are dissatisfied. The message instead will be to our kids that we no longer invest in your future, your education. And to our teachers, the message will be we no longer invest in the best. Brookline has never given up on itself, on its schools. We have never made our children suffer for our frustrations over politics and policy. So let's send a different message to our kids and our community. Your future is our future, and that future is bright. Yes, for Brookline.
Thank you to our panel. Thank you to our moderator. Thank you to the high school students who assisted with your questions. And thank you to the audience for your interest, for your questions, for your voting on May 5th. We'll be back in this room on April 29th for a candidates forum to hear from those people running for the Board of Selectmen and the school committee. Thank you.
I ran out.